Today, we are going to start off with a focus on evolution, not how we became human beings, but rather evolution of industries. And so when we talk about evolution of industries, it's not just about the knowledge base of innovative activities that are currently taking place in the industries, but also the knowledge of, the base of learning. So, and the capabilities that the firms handle individually to be able to cope with these industries. So our first speaker for today comes from the world of LinkedIn, Douglas Cole. He's an enterprise relationships manager at LinkedIn. Douglas completed his Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science and English from this very university. Later, he did his Master's in English from U of T and a second one in Global Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. And then he went on to completing his MBA from the Wharton Business School. So without further ado, let's welcome Douglas Cole.
Where's the pointer? Sound check. So I have about 20 minutes. 20 minutes, okay. It's always nice to be operating under Canadian time conditions. I've noticed when I've been to the States that we have a very different cultural approach to keeping time as compared to our neighbors in the South. When someone goes over time in the States, usually what happens is that two very large men grab him by the lapels, throw him to the ground, pummel him to the edge of consciousness, and then reach for their tasers just in case he tries to move. In Canada, by contrast, the host usually looks uncomfortably at her watch when it's about time. So obviously, this is very much to our credit as a country. So let me just give you quickly my outline. I want to talk about three things today. I want to talk, first of all, about the evolution of the corporation itself. Second of all, I want to talk about how those changes manifest themselves in the consulting industry. And then third, I want to talk about what advice I might have to offer people who are thinking of getting into consulting, which I presume would represent a significant percentage of the people here. But before I do that, I should probably just take a minute or so just to explain my background and my perspective on this, because it's important for you to understand, I think, where I'm coming from. So, as Luda said, I've actually been with LinkedIn since January of this year, so officially I've been out of consulting for the last few months, but I worked in the industry for about 15 years before that, and I worked across three different areas of consulting. I was an independent advisor within the resources sector. I was a consultant within the strategy practice of Accenture, where I worked across a variety of industries and functions. And then, most relevant to this discussion, for the last 3 years, I worked with a niche firm that I would call a crowd-based advisory firm. It's a New York-based firm, and that is where I got a lot of my impressions of what's really happening in the consulting industry. That firm was called 10X. It was founded by a former McKinsey partner. He spent about 20 years with McKinsey and built up a determination to disrupt and shake up the consulting industry. So he founded 10X, and what we did essentially was combine a expert networking service with an online talent marketplace. We would work for consulting agencies, or companies, I should say, all the big names you can think of: McKinsey, Bain, BCG, Accenture, Deloitte, whatever used to work for them. It was about a third of the business. Another third of the business were large enterprises like GE, and the other third were private equity shops who were doing due diligence engagements. And so that experience really taught me a lot, and you're going to see the fingerprints of that experience on much of what I have to talk about today with respect to this topic. Without any further ado, let's get into the first question, the evolution of the corporation. In fact, we are going to talk about human history to some degree, because I think there is an analogy that one can draw here. Typically when you think of the evolution of the company, you don't think about it in anthropological terms, but I think that there is some merit to doing that. I remember. If anyone here keeps tabs on what's happening in Silicon Valley and some of the trends and fads that are emerging out of there, you may have heard of a school of thought called dataism or data. Does anyone know what I'm talking about when I say that? Okay, so that this is a school of thought associated with Ray Kurzweil. He wrote a book called The Singularity. It's associated with a school of thought that believes that our experience as human beings is essentially an advanced computer simulation, and it believes that, or it posits that the history of human beings is basically the history of a data processing system where every individual human is a individual processing unit. And that over time, this system has become more efficient, and it's gone through 4 stages of evolution. One is just building or increasing the number of processors. The second is increasing the variety of processors. The third is increasing the connections among those processors. And the fourth is increasing the freedom of movement among those across those connections. And I think that 4-part framework is actually quite relevant to the history of the corporation. Because when you think about how the corporation has evolved, it's actually quite similar. So just as we initially built families, and the corporation was essentially at first all about just bringing as many family members as possible into it. It was very much a kind of insular enterprise. Over time, we built cities, and just as the corporation built much more complicated crossways or cross connections within the enterprise to allow divisions and functions and to collide and to cross-pollinate. And then we developed countries and we developed empires, just as the corporation developed transnational enterprises, multinational enterprises, trains, planes, automobiles, communication technology. All of this facilitated that expansion. And then finally, we built, as human beings, we built a kind of a human or a global community. And we've kind of moved to a point where the corporation, too, has done something similar, moving into a kind of 4th dimension where by allowing or by creating much more freedom across those connections, it's essentially made geography irrelevant. And so many corporations operate within this new 4th dimension, this virtual dimension, that allows extraordinary freedom of movement for the people within those corporations, right? So all of this has happened, of course, because of technology, and so whereas human evolution, as we've just described it, has gone on over a period of a couple million years, this has all happened over a much shorter period of time. And that's all because of technology, and specifically the way in which technology has allowed for ubiquity of information, a greater ease of collaboration, where the transaction costs are virtually zero, as also the abundance of talent. So that, I think, would explain how things have evolved. There's a great book which sort of speaks to the last stage here called Exponential Organizations. And it talks about the fact that virtually any enterprise, particularly a company that is a knowledge-based company, which of course describes most companies today, is that the corporation has no option but to emulate the characteristics of the internet itself, to become more open, more distributed in such a way. So that, I think, is relevant to understand as we think about. You'll see why this applies as we get into the specifics of consulting. But let me also talk then about some of the implications on 3 levels down. So we've talked about how the company itself has outsourced a lot of functions, how it has decentralized authority, how it has become much more distributed. And I think that what we've seen in time is that there's a shift in the sense that, or the paradox, I should say, in the sense that what has allowed these companies to become more ambitious in terms of their global strategy has also empowered much smaller entities. And so these large companies now face incredibly serious threats from much smaller entities, because the same technologies that enable and empower those large entities also empower the smaller ones. They're using the same technologies at the end of the day. And so you can have a situation where, for instance, Facebook buys Instagram for $1 billion for a company of 13 people, and just an amazing turn of events when you think about the history. And similarly, you have a corporation like GE, which is probably the best example of a very large corporation who incorporates all the best practices of a startup. GE was actually one of our top clients when I was with 10X, and so I had really close exposure to the FastWorks program over there. Now, the FastWorks program was basically when GE took Eric Ries, who was the author of a book called The Lean Startup, and he has a framework for thinking about getting a minimum viable product to market, setting measures or metrics in place, and then building a learning feedback loop for anything that you want to take to market. And so those startup principles are now just deeply entrenched across an organization that has 300,000 people and earns $150 billion each year, right? So that's an example of how there's been a shift from these corporate behemoths to a collection of agile startups, as a result of these trends we're talking about. In the case of the job, I think traditionally one could say the job was an expression of this top-down structure. You had an HR department that defined the role characteristics, the skills, and the knowledge that was necessary to do that job well, and it represented a really fixed mindset over what was needed to be successful. And I think what's happened over time is that, and you see it now again if you go to Silicon Valley, which is kind of the epicenter of this stuff. There was a book that came out by, in fact, the co-founder of LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman. He co-wrote a book called The Alliance with another gentleman named Ben Casnacha, and they postulated that it's just no longer reasonable for a company to expect loyalty from an employee, especially a good employee, and nor is it reasonable for an employee to expect security from a company, particularly if the working conditions are less than ideal. So they proposed something called a tour of duty concept, which is gaining more and more traction. And the tour of duty concept basically says, let's make an agreement. Let's say let's commit to a 1 to 3 year window between the corporation and the individual, where each of them commits to the corporation commits to providing growth opportunities to the employee, and the employee commits to exceeding expectations. And if either one of them reneges on that commitment over that 1 to 3 year window, then that party has every right to terminate the agreement. If, on the other hand, both of them do what they say they were going to do, then you just set up another tour of duty. So this whole concept, I think, just represents the sense in which we're just dealing with a much more fluid, liquid environment. The job market especially is liquid, and that is reflected in the way that we think about the job nowadays. And then in terms of the task, that too, I think, has changed. The way we think about work. Initially, work was basically a one-to-many and a time-based relationship, where an employee was expected to do a number of different tasks and was given an annual salary to cover that range of activities. But if you go back to the trends that we've just been talking about here, if you think about the abundance of information, for example, what that means is that every employee is exposed to more and more information that affects the operating environment of a business. But because you're exposed to more and more information, which is on the one hand very empowering to the corporation, you're also presented with more decision variables. And as you're presented with more decision variables, it becomes more complex to make a decision, and therefore you need specialists. You need specialists to help you figure out what the optimal course of action is. And so as with the abundance of information comes the rise or the demand for specialization, and it becomes unreasonable to expect that employee to master various areas of specialization. Instead, I think what we're seeing more and more is a shift from a one-to-many relationship to more of a many-to-many relationship. So instead of having one individual responsible for multiple tasks, those many tasks are matched to many individual experts who are better suited to performing them. And that employee shrinks his or her area of responsibility down to core functions and then just focuses on assigning those surplus tasks, if you want to call them, to the right expert. Right? So those, I think, are the kind of knock-on or follow-on implications of the corporate evolution that we're seeing right now. So then let's talk about how this affects consulting in particular, because it's all related at the end of the day. The consulting industry is, after all, a B2B business, and so for a consulting firm to survey business, it needs to understand what's happening to business in general. And within consulting, there are 4 buzzwords that are quite pervasive. You hear them mentioned quite a lot. So tip of the spear basically refers to your strategy, your first foot forward with a client, where you go in and you define the strategy canvas for that player in the market, and it's usually a 2 to 5 year plan that you help them construct. That then becomes the basis for an implementation plan. And so you can see there's a very linear relationship between strategy and implementation. The strategy itself is assumed to be very comprehensive in order to ensure that implementation is moving along in the way that it should. But we're now moving to, well, given all these trends that I've been talking about, given the number of connections and the freedom of movement across those connections, it's just a world in which a 2 to 5 year strategy doesn't make an awful lot of sense anymore. And there's just, there's too much, there are too many things that can happen in order to upend the assumptions of the strategy. And so we're moving to an environment where I think the strategy itself is becoming more compressed, and where you now have an opportunity to deliver strategy in the form of much smaller consumption packages over the course of the implementation period. So when I was in 10X, for example, we had many projects where, instead of doing a strategy project, which typically would take about 2 months in a traditional fashion, we would do in about 3 weeks. We had many situations where we would do a very short assessment. There was, for instance, a sovereign wealth fund that was taking a position that was making an investment in fusion energy, as they described it, as a call on energy disruption. And they wanted us to basically do a 2-week project to kind of see whether this fusion company was essentially a Hollywood set or a real thing, right? So that kind of assessment, which requires very specific and very deep expertise, but can actually be done in a very efficient way. It's just a mark of these changes that I'm talking about. The second piece, utilization. So utilization is one of the mainstays of consulting as well. Obviously, the economic model is dependent on maximizing the utilization percentage, which is to say the number of your staff who are billable at any given time, or the percentage of your staff who are billable at any given time. And utilization traditionally, of course, has been based on utilizing all your internal staff and maximizing that number. But it doesn't make all that much sense to measure utilization in the same way if you think about all these trends. Again, right now in North America, there are about 250,000 independent consultants, just in North America. And about 1/5 of those independent consultants come from very big brand names like McKinsey, Bain, BCG, et cetera. And it just doesn't make a lot of sense, for a consulting firm who wants to be as nimble as possible in order to respond to client needs, to rely only on internal resources in that kind of environment. From the consultants, or from the independent consultant's point of view, there's a reasonable expectation to want to work wherever he or she wants, under the conditions that he or she wants, in order to pursue whatever side projects that are important. And so that should be accommodated somehow, particularly when that individual has already been through the rigors of a hiring process from a major firm and is therefore being vetted in a sense. There's no reason to think that an independent consultant couldn't be a contingent employee for a major consulting firm, right? So, and we're starting to see this. One of the major consulting firms in Canada that I've met with actually had a program where they were allowing a portion of the workforce to take a year off, and within that year to have the freedom to pursue whatever they were hoping to pursue personally, but also to be on call, as it were, for on-demand engagements. So I think that's just a sign of things to come with respect to utilization. With operating models, so the operating model is a very, very common buzzword as well, the way the firm structures itself in order to go to market. Traditionally, this was a matrix structure, and when I was in consulting, we used to go through these adjustments every 3 to 4 years. There was some clunky reshifting around, and it just felt unnatural to have one team that you were previously affiliated with kind of torn apart and reconfigured in a different way. That doesn't make much sense anymore. Again, I mean, you have the wisdom of networks that just organically emerge, and that seems to be, I think, the better blueprint for thinking about how to organize knowledge pools and expertise pools within a firm. And we're starting to see that more and more as well. And then finally, the whole concept of the trusted advisor. Trust is, after all, the cornerstone of the consulting industry. You're not going to have a business as a consultant if you violate the expectation that your trust can never be broken. You have to show impartiality, you have to show competence, you have to show understanding, openness. All these things are part of what constitutes trust. And so you could argue on the one hand that that cornerstone would be a significant barrier to some of these innovations that I'm talking about. And in fact, it has been raised as an argument in some occasions. But I would argue that we just need to flip the narrative here and sort of think about trust in a slightly different way. There's absolutely no reason why you can't say as a firm, now we recognize that statistically speaking, there's going to be a much higher number of smart and capable people outside of our own firm than within it. I mean, that's just the law of numbers. But we will ensure that whoever we bring to the table, whether that person is within or outside of our corporate boundaries, we are going to uphold very specific and very exacting standards with respect to quality and professionalism. And I don't think there's any reason why that can't be done, and in fact, it is being done more and more as I've described. So those are the ways in which I think the consulting model is adjusting to some of these corporate trends that I was describing. So let's go to the final point, which is more of a practical point in terms of what I would advise someone who is trying to get into the consulting industry. I would say these three things. So number one, clearly one of the things we've talked about a lot is the importance of specialization. In the past, it really didn't matter what industry you wanted to get into. You weren't really expected to have a point of view on that. But I do think that the bar has been raised in that respect. I think that on the demand side, that is to say from the perspective of clients themselves, there are more and more expectations with respect to expertise. And so when you're applying to consulting firms, I think it's really important to demonstrate some area of specialization. If you don't have that, to develop it fairly early because it's increasingly important. Number two, I think just given the fact that we've talked about the way in which digital underlies pretty much everything we've talked about, that you need to earn your technical stripes. You need to show that you have an understanding of technology and of digital and how that underpins whatever industry you're talking about, whether it's coding, whether it's some other aspect of technology. That you need to, I think, demonstrate that that's some area that you have more than a passing familiarity with. And then the third piece of advice, which is in some sense at odds with the first, is that I think that you do need to focus on rapid and serial reinvention. The reason I say that is that not just because the world is changing very quickly and that's not going to stop anytime soon, and it's therefore important to be able to adjust. I think that's true, but I also think that when I step back and look at consulting and what the real benefit of consulting is in terms of your personal development, I think that ultimately this last piece is quite important. When you make it a habit and a routine to reinvent yourself and think about how you can just become a new version of yourself, I think that whole process builds confidence. I think it is just a really necessary ingredient to your long-term career. I also think it builds sympathy and empathy. When you go through a process of getting to learn new areas very quickly, you become more able to put yourselves in the shoes of other people based on those actual experience and based on the process of doing so. And then third, I just think it makes you a better leader to go through that process, because the more areas you begin to get exposed to and to gradually master, that generalist experience is, I think, what underlies good leadership. A good leader is someone who is a connector, who's an integrator, someone who sees connections and who can predict on the basis of those interconnections. And so I think that needs to be balanced in the way that we talk about the specialization, how important that is. I think that consulting, really the uniqueness of consulting is in the way that it builds these fundamentals of leadership. So those are my thoughts. I hope that's helpful.
We're open to any questions for about 2 minutes. If you have any questions for Doug, feel free to ask him.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
So my first question is about the first point, about specializing early. Are we talking about technical side specialization or industry or both?
Well, I guess it is both. It used to be that, the primary feeder schools for consulting were just MBA shops, right? The MBA programs. But that's clearly no longer the case. I think if you come from engineering, if you come from medicine, you come from, econometrics, there are different areas of specialization, all of which I think are really useful, depending on how you position, that specialization in the firm. Yeah. Hi.
Very interesting, thank you. There was a recent, I think it's HBR article talking about the disruption of consulting, which aligned very well with your stuff. And they mentioned that firms like McKinsey are actually developing technologies, and they're implementing these as sort of digital practices, moving away from even the human capital of their firm and delivering it sort of apps and and other technology so that the firms can actually use those things. Do you see this going beyond some of the disruption that you've mentioned, and they're sort of starting to package like some kind of processes or procedures or sort of decision aids in that way and adding that to their primarily person-heavy kind of delivery?
Yeah, you're talking about McKinsey Solutions, right? I think that was the reference in the article. That's clearly going to be a big thing. I mean, I'm not. I think it is. I think it is. It's definitely going to be a component of the way they go to market. There was a quote I remember hearing from Warren Bennis, who's the management guru, and he was a former advisor to Reagan and Nixon, I believe. And he said that the company of the future is going to have two employees. It's going to have a man and a dog. And the job of the man is going to be to feed the dog, and the job of the dog is going to be prevent the man from touching the equipment, right? I don't see it going in that direction. I don't see things evolving to a point where it's all machine based. There's clearly just in the same way. I was listening to an interview the other day with Gary Kasparov, the Russian chess master who was defeated by IBM computer in the mid-90s, and he said that today there's not a single human who can defeat a computer because of the computational power that's been developed, but there's not a single computer that can defeat the combination of a computer and a man, or a person, I should say. So I think that's sort of the way we're going. I think that it's going to be that exponential combination of computational power in the form of machines and data and humans, which really amplifies the brain power of the firm. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. So I'm wondering, what is your opinion on some technical stripes at its value today and also maybe 5 to 10 years in the future?
Well, I mentioned coding before. I think literacy in coding. I think coding is the new language in some sense. Everything sort of goes back to the ones and zeros. So I think that some degree of coding chops would be a good thing, and just understanding the digital dimensions of any business that you're working in. Whether you're working in oil and gas and you understand predictive models within that context, or whether you're in the airline industry and you understand demand models within that context. I mean, I just think that you just need to sort of dig into the technical foundations or of each of those spaces.
All right, that would be it. Again, a round of applause for Douglas Cole.